The UN fact-finding mission report has singled out 6 generals they believe should stand trial.
The latest sanctions aim to slash about $1.3 billion from the DPRK's annual trade revenues.
And 4 times it failed to agree on a statement calling for a ceasefire. Clashes between the signatories of the peace deal nearly derailed the agreement. One of the largest humanitarian tragedies of our time and the worst refugee crisis since World War II. Of all the crises faced by this international organization made up of 193 nations, climate change is the one issue that binds us all. The United Nations turned 75 at a time of unprecedented challenges, when an increasingly fragmented world is facing off against the coronavirus pandemic, when social distancing is keeping world leaders from traveling here to converge at the General Assembly as they have for decades. So how does the UN make sure nations standing apart are not standing alone? And today's wars against global terrorism and climate change have dominated the conversation. As conflicts divided countries and colonies gained independence, the membership of the United Nations nearly quadrupled from 51 countries in 1946 to 193 nations today. And in any normal year, the UN General Assembly Hall in New York, is where they convene to engage in diplomacy, vote on resolutions, and rage against global injustice. The Venezuela exodus has become one of the world's biggest displacement crises. But despite the daunting number of people fleeing violence and seeking refuge, governments are still closing doors and building walls. Despite a resolution every year, the vote actually carries very little weight because it is not legally binding. What it does do is send a very clear message that the US stands virtually alone on this issue that many countries see as politically unnecessary and morally questionable for its impact on the civilian population. Here at the United Nations in April 2016, member nations signed on to the landmark Paris climate deal to limit the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. The challenge, however, has been on how to follow through on promises and ramp up levels of ambition. But the Trump administration's defense of American interests and criticism of the UN may not be entirely unfounded. Other experts have bemoaned the excesses and abuses within UN agencies and have called for reforms. Now, those sanctions intensified in the past year and has hit hard at the DPRK's economy. As for Palestinian aspirations for full UN membership, that is unlikely to happen, as it would draw an almost guaranteed US veto within the Security Council.
There appears to be an indication that the latest peace deal in South Sudan will be implemented. What's the view of the UN on this agreement?
Well, the UN as a whole is cautiously optimistic. We did hear from the Assistant Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operations, who briefed the Security Council and told member states that she welcomed the deal, but that further discussions are needed to iron out details to make sure that this time this agreement works. The nuclear ban treaty was adopted by 122 members of the United Nations General Assembly and needs 50 ratifications to go into effect. The goal is to prevent the type of atomic bombings that devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki from ever happening again. This is the UN General Assembly. And in that top seat behind me in the middle, President Maria Fernanda Espinosa Garces presides over this Assembly of Nations. It is only the 4th time in the 73-year history of this world body that a woman has been elected to the position. The threats of physical and sexual violence have played a role at a time when the security situation in the Kasai region and eastern DRC remains tense and also dangerous for women to vote, much less run for office. Nikki Haley made clear Washington's position that even though diplomacy remains on the table as an option, it will retaliate if further provoked. And apart from addressing the virus's increasing resistance to older types of HIV/AIDS treatment, global health experts say it also overcomes the high manufacturing costs of HIV drugs. The Security Council on Tuesday extended sanctions against Eritrea, originally put in place over the country's alleged support of the Al-Shabaab militant group in Somalia. The UN says it requires $4.4 billion by the end of March to avert a catastrophe. The question now is whether the international community still has the appetite and capacity to respond above and beyond previous humanitarian appeals that have fallen far short. The UN Security Council can impose sanctions and embargoes and refer war crimes to the International Criminal Court. But the UN's strongest body is also its biggest problem, because when major powers cannot agree, they use their power of veto to block action. And then little gets done. The symbolic vote does deliver a stinging rebuke to the US, which finds itself once again largely isolated from the international community on yet another key issue. With Japan and Ukraine on board, eyes will be on how tensions will play out between Kiev and Moscow, as well as Tokyo and Beijing. This resolution has a 10-year expiration date within which UN sanctions can automatically be reimposed if Iran fails to act on its promises. This is the snapback mechanism. It may seem as if the world is falling apart as crises pile up and disease spreads. Those were the very words spoken by the United Nations Secretary General as he stood at this podium addressing nations this past September. He was calling for leadership as the ghosts of the Cold War returned and as much of the Arab Spring went horribly wrong.